Firstly, I'd like to say that we appreciate your attendance as we begin an hour-long session around some of the current legal challenges when it comes to dealing with compliance and strategic governance. It goes without saying that there is, of course, a lot to get through from both topical and geographical aspects, and our panel will do their very best and are very excited to provide some high-class insights and thoughts around this topic. We welcome contributions from you in the audience. Our platform's able to take questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. So please do comment, ask questions. We'd love to hear from you. Just so you're aware, today's session is being recorded and it will be available publicly in the coming week online and to download. So before handing over to the panel, I have 2 points to run through briefly. Firstly, the International Comparative Legal Guides, or ICLG, is proud to have launched the 2025 edition of our Corporate Governance Laws and Regulations Guide just a couple of months ago. The ICLG Corporate Governance publication has insights into 21 jurisdictions and takes a deep dive into international trends in corporate governance and stewardship. And we will be providing everyone in attendance an opportunity to download the 2025 publication on a complimentary basis after the webinar. So do keep your eyes open for that communication. Secondly, I would like to thank our partner, the Association of Governance, Risk and Compliance, a brilliant organization supporting the GRC community through knowledge exchange, networking, and idea incubation. The programs that the AGRC run are raising standards of ethics and integrity in the world of compliance and boosting the industry's knowledge and understanding of best practice, professional development, and new technologies. So if you've not seen much about the AGRC, go and have a look at their website after the webinar, agrc.org, and feel free to reach out to myself or Mateo for more information. And that brings me on nicely to welcome Mateo, Global Manager at the AGRC. Mateo will be our moderator today. He will do the formal introductions of the panel and move the discussion forwards. So please do enjoy the session, everyone, and good luck to the panel. And Mateo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for the introduction, and thank you to ICLG for supporting us with this webinar and for partnering up with us on this webinar series that now has become an annual sort of thing. We run 3 webinars a year with ICLG and the GLG, so very happy to be here with both Loren and Terri. As Ben mentioned, we will have some time towards the end of the session for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions as you listen to what Terri and Loren are sharing with us, just drop those questions in the Q&A. I will monitor those and I will get to those towards the end of the hour so we can cover those for you. With that out of the way, we have 8 questions here that we're going to touch upon, covering a whole range of aspects related to corporate governance and compliance. And what's interesting here is we're going to get it from 2 sort of geographical perspectives. We have Loren, who's going to be talking about these issues from a US perspective, while Terri will be covering the UK. So it should give you a pretty good sort of compare and contrast when it comes to corporate governance in both jurisdictions. Before starting, I would like to first of all welcome both Loren and Terri and have you briefly introduce yourselves to the audience. Just tell us a little bit about who you are, what is your, what drives you, what are your passions when it comes to corporate governance, and then we can get started with the 8 questions we have here. Terri?
Hi, Mateo. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a Chartered Governance Professional, which means I'm qualified by the Chartered Governance Institute and also have a number of years' experience, which they've confirmed. I'm a governance geek, so I also have a master's in corporate governance, and I'm trying to single-handedly stop that collective groan that we hear when people talk about governance. As you say, I'm UK-based. I've got a lot of experience in highly regulated industries, banking, private wealth, and fund administration, and multi-jurisdictional.
Thank you, Terri. Loren?
Thank you for having me. My name is Loren Braswell. I'm counsel at Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz, based out of New York. I focus my practice on corporate governance, sustainability, and shareholder activism. Like Terri, I consider myself a corporate governance geek. And so I'm very excited for the conversation today and looking forward to hearing the UK perspective in addition to my own US-based perspective.
Excellent. Thank you, Lauren. So to get started, I mean, let's look at regulatory evolution and board adaptation, mainly how the board has adapted to all these regulatory changes that have been happening. And this one is for Terri to get us started with the UK perspective, let's say. And the question is, how have recent regulatory changes in financial services, particularly around ESG, disclosure, digital assets, and AI governance, reshaped board oversight responsibilities? And what practical challenges are boards facing in keeping pace with these regulatory changes? Terri?
I think recent regulation, the stronger sustainability, ESG disclosure regimes, comprehensive digital asset frameworks, and the nascent but very fast-moving AI rules have moved board oversight from high-level intent to detailed, verifiable controls and accountability. And I think that raises both the scope and technical depth of their responsibilities. They've shifted from almost theoretical to practical, from principles to proof. Boards are now expected to not just approve the strategy, but document the process, the metrics, and external disclosures, which means the oversight of the quality of the data assurance processes. And for example, in ESG, they now have to confirm that their vendors are doing what they should be doing. Asset classes, there's now explicit accountability. Digital assets is governed by dedicated regimes, MiCA in the EU, and rules are growing nationally. Boards must know which line of businesses fall into scope and the licensing that they're impacted by. And then AI has just come out of nowhere. That's moving at a fast pace. What's particularly challenging around AI is that different jurisdictions have adopted very different approaches. So you might have a US-based company that's captured by the US regime, but also transacts with people in the EU, has customers in the EU, so then they would be caught by the EU AI Act. So that's a jurisdictionally challenging one. I think the practical challenges for the board is the data governance gap. How do they ensure the information that they're getting is quality? And they want quality over quantity. They don't want lots and lots and lots of data that they've got to wade through. They want information on an exceptions basis, and they need to decide what those exceptions are. As I've said earlier, rapid changes across jurisdictions, especially with AI, but across everything, is a challenge. There's a lot of comply or explain, which is being adopted. That's a British principle that's starting to be adopted in different jurisdictions, which is quite interesting. And then capacity and literacy. AI is actually something that people have been using for a very long time, perhaps without knowing. They've got an Alexa or the spell check in Word or, helping us fix formulas in Excel. But generative and agentic AI is new and people are understandably nervous about it. So directors need to become tech literate enough to be able to understand if what they're being told smells right. But they're not expected to be AI experts, which is a blessing and a curse because now it means lots of people are claiming that they are AI experts and the directors have got to figure out which ones are the right ones to seek advice from. And that absolutely does fall within their remit to be accountable. And then auditability, if you're a medium to large size firm, you might have an internal audit function. What do they know about these things? What do they know about AI or different asset types? How can they confirm that the business is doing what it should be doing? So I think the questions the board should be asking is, do we have an ESG data map, an assurance plan and a named owner? Which AI and digital assets are we using? Do we have that documented? Do we have governance and incident playbooks in place? And are board reports showing leading indicators and lagging outcomes? And if not, that needs to be fixed.
Thank you, Terri. Lauren, what's your perspective from the US?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I just wanted to add, from a US perspective, I think the regulations aren't quite yet caught up to the realities on the ground of what's needed on a board level in terms of AI expertise and AI management. And I think, there are tech companies and companies who have AI as part of their business strategy. that are at the forefront of this and have been thinking for a long time about how do you integrate AI expertise into your boardroom? How do you integrate AI expertise, into your human capital deployment? But for companies, who are not necessarily at the forefront of technology as part of sort of their day-to-day business strategy, I think it's a much larger challenge of first of all, how does AI even fit into our business model? Are we using AI on a day-to-day basis? I think increasingly you're seeing that, even if you're not a technology company, there are ways in which AI is being integrated into business models sort of throughout the corporate ecosystem.
Mhm.
And then what is the expertise needed in the boardroom to sort of manage those processes? And like Terri said, what does it really mean to have AI expertise versus, to check the box on a skills matrix to say you have the AI expertise? That's an important distinction.
Thank you, Loren. Going along the same sort of route, talking about technology and technology risks. I mean, we brought up AI, and this is again a question for Terri. But with the rapid adoption of AI, blockchain, and cloud technologies in the financial services, how should boards balance that need for technical expertise with traditional governance skills? And should boards actually mandate technology literacy requirements for directors?
Well, as I said earlier, boards don't need to become technical teams, but they must be technically literate enough to ask the right questions, to set the risk appetite and validate insurances. They should mandate the baseline technology literacy and adopt structural ways to plug in expertise. So do we have our own, cybersecurity, for example, do we have our own IT department? Do we have an appropriate person to report to the board? And that isn't just send a 7-page report to the board on an annual basis. It's present to the board, be available for questions. I think the board needs to balance technical expertise with traditional governance skills. And there's complementary approaches which both work. So the core governance competence, every director has to understand the fundamentals, cloud shared responsibility, basic crypto custody concepts, model risk, data lineage. But obviously this all depends what business they're in, how much of these things their business is doing. It's very much not a one and done anymore. I like to think governance was never one and done. So when people put policies in places, they were regularly reviewing them. I think perhaps in some industries and organizations that slipped, but these things need to be reviewed regularly because, AI is a great example, but the same is true for all of them. Look at how much ESG has moved since it was first brought in and people will start talking about it. There's a lot of focus on the E, less so on the S and the G. So we need to make sure that we're balancing all of that. And then for deep technical judgment, they need to get in the right expertise and they need to be auditing that information. So if someone turns up and says, I've got 50 years experience in AI and I'm going to help your audit firm and I think you should absolutely employ me, a healthy amount of skepticism and some due diligence to see whether that's true or not is appropriate. And even if the person says they've got 2 years experience, that's appropriate. I think governance has always been about being pragmatic. It's never been business prevention. It's always been let's try and move the business forward. So I think board directors completing an annual competency matrix, where are our skill gaps? Where do we need to fill them? And I'm not suggesting we need to turn boards over, but maybe when we're hiring the next board member, especially if we're looking for a NED, so we're bringing them in externally, what skill set would be useful? What background would be useful? Risk committees are sometimes being expanded to become technology and risk committees, which is a great way to leverage the technological expertise that's already within the business. Directors need to interrogate data more. So rather than going back to the same example, rather than once a year getting an update from the cybersecurity team, they need to be asking sensible questions. Regulators want to see that they're engaging with the process, not that they're passively receiving the reports and taking everything as read.
Mhm. That makes perfect sense. Loren, what is your anything to add here?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Terri's sentiments about the utility of a technology and cybersecurity risk committee. Obviously it's company dependent, industry dependent, context dependent, but we're increasingly seeing that boards are finding a lot of use out of forming specialized committees that look at cybersecurity and technology risks just as a way to put that on the board agenda for the year and have dedicated directors and dedicated meetings that are, specifically addressing those types of risks and those types of business strategy questions, apart from, the full board meetings, where obviously these questions should be coming up in the ordinary course anyway, because they're material to the business and material to the company. But a specialized committee can be a good way of isolating what the real risks and priorities are for the company and focusing the directors on this set of questions.
Perfect. Excellent. Let's shift gears now a little bit. And now this is a question for Loren. And let's look a little bit about, that old question of, stakeholder versus shareholder. And the question is, financial institutions are increasingly expected to serve broader stakeholders' interests beyond shareholders. How are boards navigating potential conflicts between profitability and stakeholder expectations, particularly regarding lending practices and investment decisions? Loren?
Yeah, so historically, shareholder primacy has sort of been the lodestar of corporate governance practice in the United States.
Right.
Question has always been, how does the company maximize short-term profits for our shareholders, regardless of the impact for the broader community and broader corporate ecosystem? And recently that's been changing, and folks are starting to recognize the importance of how does the company's actions impact customers, clients, suppliers, and the broader communities, and how do we think about that and balance those needs against the needs of our shareholders, who are ultimately the investors and the ultimate voters in the corporate ecosystem. Our firm has recently been talking about something called the new paradigm of corporate governance, and that's sort of our way of describing this balance, and encouraging boards and management teams to engage with stakeholders and engage with shareholders to think about, okay, how do we resist sort of the short-termism thinking of just maximizing profits and popping the stock in the short term, to think about, okay, how do we create sustainable long-term value that is good for our shareholders, but also good for the broader community and the broader ecosystem. And I think there's almost a false dichotomy that sometimes exists. Is it good for the shareholder, or is it good for the stakeholder? In Delaware, as in most U.S. jurisdictions, the main sort of fiduciary law question is still, do what's in the best interest of the company and its shareholders. But increasingly in this ecosystem, what's good for the shareholders in the long term is actually very intimately intertwined with what's good for clients, customers, suppliers, the community, the environment. And so thinking about that in a holistic way, and sort of thinking about those two interests as not diametrically opposed, but actually intimately intertwined. I think boards are increasingly recognizing that and thinking about that in a more holistic way. When it comes to lending practices, U.S. companies are obviously very highly regulated and very highly scrutinized, particularly in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis and in the wake of Dodd-Frank. But boards should also be thinking about this and sort of self-regulating, in a sense that, it's so important for the banking community to maintain the goodwill and the trust of the regulatory ecosystem and, the general public. And so acting in a way that is good for the public, good for broader society, ultimately is what's in the best interest of the business, and therefore the shareholders who own the business.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Has there been a similar shift in the UK, Terri, from your experience?
Yeah, there definitely has. I think it's interesting that this is something that Europe has been better at for a longer period of time. A lot of European countries have stakeholders represented often on their boards as a matter of course. So this is actually something that I think we can learn a lot from Europe on. Germany, for example, I'm not picking just because it pops to mind, that then there's others that are just as good, often have employee representatives on the boards. So I think there's a lot of tried and tested information out there that the UK and the US can refer to. So it's great that we're kind of catching up.
Excellent. Now let's look at crisis preparedness and resilience. Again, another question for Loren. Following the recent banking sector stress events, talking about the 2008 financial crisis, let's say, what governance frameworks are proving most effective for crisis preparedness, and how should boards structure their oversight of operational resilience and business continuity planning? Loren?
Yeah, so when it comes to risk oversight and crisis preparedness, we encourage something that we call a noses in and hands out approach, which is, the board should be very actively involved in oversight of the company's enterprise risk, but not sort of involved in the day-to-day management of the company's business. And so what that means for many boards, it's helpful, like Terri said, to have a risk committee or to have some sort of structure that's specifically focused on enterprise risk and sort of what potential crises and scenario planning we can do to make sure that we're exercising our oversight duty. For some boards, that function is centralized in the audit committee, which can work as well. But what's really important is that the boards are scenario planning, thinking carefully about, okay, what risks are coming down the pike and how are we as a company prepared to handle those risks, whether it be, liquidity risks, capital risks, cybersecurity risks is a big one for a lot of companies, but banks in particular. And that's one we're seeing a lot with U.S. companies recently is cybersecurity attacks and the implications of those on both the companies and the customers. And I think if a crisis does arise or if a risk does materialize, it's all about resilience and how the board reacts and what the company learns from that experience. We had the COVID pandemic just a few years ago. That's a risk and a crisis that nobody could have anticipated, that probably no board in America was effectively planning for just a year before the pandemic hit. And so the question is, okay, how do you respond? And then how do you effectively think about, okay, what are the lessons learned? And how do we implement those effectively, both in our policies and our practices moving forward, so that the next time, a pandemic or something that looks like a pandemic that can really slow down our supply chain, slow down our business, create huge human capital issues. How do we better manage that through our policies and practices moving forward? I think the most resilient and most effective boards are the boards that can take those lessons learned and, use them as sort of impetus to improve their practices moving forward.
Thank you, Loren. Terri?
I agree with everything that Loren said. I think lessons can be learned from others too. So as well as what's happened to us and what can we learn from, what's happened in our industry or perhaps even other industries that we can learn from. In the UK, under banking regulations, they have an ICAP process, which they need to complete on an annual or biannual basis, depending who their regulator is. That's almost a, let's figure out how we're going to break the bank. And although hopefully they never do, it gives them a playbook to play by. So when things do go wrong, hopefully they've already got a scenario in place or an idea of how to play through the scenario. But I think Loren's right. Nobody would have predicted COVID. But look how well most places did. And I think that shows, corporate resiliency and inventiveness can be amazing when it needs to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Now, let's look at executive compensation, which has been in the news and has been something that has been touched upon across the board. And this was for Terri, looking at executive compensation and performance metrics. How are financial services boards evolving their approach to executive compensation structures, particularly linking pay to long-term value creation, risk management, and ESG performance rather than short-term financial metrics? Terri?
And this is a really interesting one. And I think it has a social element or a societal element, which we don't often see in the corporate world. So I'm quite excited about this. they're trying to discourage the short-termism, and so they're putting in place longer incentives with longer values, not just returns, not just KPIs and quantitative, but also qualitative. So, if you're seen at a Coldplay concert with somebody you shouldn't have been at, that's potentially going to affect your future bonuses. So I think it's really interesting. And I think some of this feeds from stakeholder activism. Actually, directors are being held accountable. I remember a number of years ago now, there was a CEO who was caught bunking the train in London and hadn't paid for their train fare. And that became a big scandal. And I think because of how news is moving and we're hearing so much more and it's much more quickly, I think that really is meaning that directors are being held to a level of accountability that they hadn't been before, which, as a governance professional is great. Good governance professionals keep directors out of prison. So, sometimes they're our biggest hurdle to that. So longer deferral windows, risk-adjusted pay. It's not just good enough that the shareholder returns are X. As you said, we need to have ESG results. We need to have, some are even bringing employee surveys into it. So and staff turnover and all those kind of metrics, which are quantifiable, but still come to kind of the softer side of things. And they're even putting in clawbacks. So, senior executives can have fantastic bonuses, but if X happens within Y timeframe, then there are opportunities for clawbacks. Risk-adjusted performance measures, ESG KPIs that are auditable. So it's not just good enough that the CEO turns up to the board and tells you that they've done really well. It has to be auditable and verified. And then board level oversight. Boards are taking much more interest in those kind of things than they used to.
Interesting. Loren, from the US perspective?
Yeah, it's only a matter of time until the Coldplay concert comes up in a corporate governance discussion.
We are 27 minutes in. I don't know if that's fast or it's a little slow. A new record. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the US, companies are highly incentivized to link their executive compensation very closely to executive performance. And we have something called a say on pay vote every year for most companies, but at most every 2 to 3 years. And that's where the investors basically get to vote on whether they support the executive compensation structure for the named executive officers for the company. And so there's sort of a real-time feedback loop where the investor community can tell you whether they think you're in line with your peers, whether you're in line with best corporate governance practices, on whether your compensation packages are structured in a way that incentivizes, both financial performance, but also, as Terri said, just general good corporate governance practices and general good ethical behavior by your named executive officers.
That makes sense. Perfect. Now, another question for Terri, looking at third-party risk and supply chain governance. Terri, with increasing reliance on fintech partnerships and cloud service providers, how should boards oversee third-party risk management? And what sort of governance structures work best for managing these extended enterprise relationships?
Third-party risk has become enterprise risk, and boards must treat critical vendors like internal business units. Expect visibility, scenario testing, contractual rights, redundancy, and active oversight. So they need to inventory and classify which are critical third-party vendors and which aren't, and then put in a scale for how quickly they need to react if something happens. There needs to be contractual and operational levers. Contractually, what is the supplier doing to make sure that they get back on track as quickly as possible? What's the continuity plan for if they don't? Concentration and systematic exposure monitoring. Are we, so for example, the recent problem with Microsoft, which led to air traffic control issues, would they have thought that they were overly exposed to risk through Microsoft? Probably not. But now that's something that will fall into their playbook. And like Loren said earlier, known knowns are one thing and we can manage them, but the unknown unknowns are the ones that are going to creep up and catch us. I don't know if you've ever heard the Baz Luhrmann song Sunscreen, but he talks about how it's not the things that we expect that catch us out, it's the things that we don't. And I think that's very true of systems. And because there's creep, so we use Microsoft, for example, because it gives us Outlook, and then we start using Word and Excel, and then we use Copilot, and then we add on all these little things incrementally, and then suddenly they become a serious third-party vendor, and there's a problem if they fall away. So again, not one and done. It's something that needs to be continually risk assessed and proper consideration given to it. And continuous assurance. Those third-party vendors, once we've assessed that they're critical, we need to continually have confirmation that they're doing what they need to be doing. And some organizations are taking that as far as having them report to the board as if they were a department. We've talked about it before, risk committees that cover third parties, vendor playbooks and war rooms, cross-functional vendor onboarding. Vendor onboarding tends to be led by one department, and then legal might review it from a contractual perspective. But actually, a bigger input needs to be given. They need to think about what dependencies do we have? What dependencies did the vendor have? I think governance professionals should often be involved because they have that kind of oversight. We deal with the people in every different business line and every different department, which not everybody has the same amount of oversight. And then regulatory horizon scanning. Some regulators are great and they give us a hint that something's coming down the pipeline and they consult and we can see it's coming. Others like to blindside us and sneak something in really quickly that we weren't expecting. So continually horizon scanning, I think, is vital too.
Thank you, Terri. Loren?
Yeah, no, that was incredibly thorough. I'm not sure I have much to add, except that I think historically the sort of hierarchy of stakeholder priorities for most companies has been, investor, customer, client, and then at the bottom, vendor, supplier. And I think in the post-pandemic world and post-Microsoft snafu, like Terri said, a lot of companies are rethinking that hierarchy, or at least taking a much closer look at the, third on that list, the vendor supplier, because, you don't have customer or client satisfaction if you don't have your vendor supplier relationships well managed, and if you don't have customer client satisfaction, you don't have that shareholder return that you're hoping for. And so as much as we think of the trickle down the list of priorities, there's also a trickle up effect. And I think a lot of companies are increasingly starting to recognize the importance of managing those relationships well, and focusing, like Terri said, on what are the material risks associated with the key supplier vendors, and the key supplier vendor contracts.
Thank you, Loren. Now, one topic we haven't touched upon much is corporate culture and how boards actually influence corporate culture. So this was for Loren. Pretty straightforward question. How can boards effectively monitor and influence organizational culture in financial services? And also, what sort of practical tools and metrics are most valuable for assessing conduct risk and ethical decision-making throughout the organization? Loren?
Yeah, I think there's a term that a lot of people in the corporate governance community are probably really tired of hearing, but I still use it with boards all the time because I think it rings as true today as it did a decade ago when the term came into prominence, and that term is tone at the top. Boards need to make sure they're setting the right cultural and ethical tone at the top. And so what does that mean? First of all, boards need to lead by example. If you don't have the right prioritization of the company's values inside of the boardroom, there's no hope for the company's overall culture. And so you have to make sure that the board is leading by example and that the directors each are very well aware, and living out the values of the company. Second of all, those values and those priorities need to be well reflected in the policies of the company. And so you need to look at the company's code of ethics and business conduct, the insider trading policies, any policies that apply broadly to the employee base. They should be reviewed on an annual or semi-annual basis to make sure they're reflecting what does the board expect in terms of the behaviors and the cultural environment that they want to set for their employee base. And then third, you really need an infrastructure that enforces those policies, because every policy is just as strong as its enforcement mechanism. And so you need to make sure you have an infrastructure in place that really identifies potential bad behavior, potential ethical issues well before they rise to a material level, and then, right courses those as well. And I think here you really need to rely a little bit on your HR team and your legal team to have their ear to the ground and be listening to employee feedback. So when you're doing your exit interviews or you're doing your employee surveys, what are employees saying? Because a lot of times, the management team of the company, and especially the board, it's hard for them to be integrated in sort of the day-to-day morale and the day-to-day cultural environment that the employees on the ground are seeing. But I think if you build a rapport with your employees and build an ecosystem where they feel comfortable giving that feedback in whatever format the company collects it, that's a really good way to keep your finger on the pulse of, what is the culture that we're setting in this company, and is it well tailored to manage risk and to manage sort of the strategic needs of the company.
Thank you, Laura. Terri, anything to add there?
I think that was great. Thank you, Lauren. Since we're referring to old maxims, one that sprung to my mind was culture eats strategy for breakfast, which I think gives to your point that actually you can have the best strategy. If you haven't got the culture that backs it up, it's not gonna happen. So I think this is practical rather than theoretical. I think boards need to interrogate data in a way that perhaps they're not used to. Exit interviews, staff turnover. If staff turnover goes up, then just having, it's because we're the training ground and our staff are being poached because they're so good and they're going to competitors because, whatever story they tell, they need to interrogate the data that that's there, because, I'm going to do another one, damn lies statistics. So it isn't enough anymore. And I think we've covered in most of the questions you've asked, Mateo. It isn't enough for them to just take the report that they've been received as read and accept that the people are giving them accurate data. They need to interrogate it. They need to be asking good questions, and they need to make sure that the experts are in the room.
Writing down all these sayings, Terri, for future use.
We love them. Us British love them.
Yeah.
That is true. Great. Well, we have one question left here, looking at the future of, board composition and diversity, and also just kind of looking towards the future when it comes to corporate governance. So anyone who's listening in, we do have some time left. We have about 20 minutes or so. I do have a couple more questions, but if you have any questions for Lauren or Terri, please plop them in the Q&A. We will have some time towards the end to cover these. So, please make sure you drop those in there so we can, we can provide you with some answers later on. So now, talking about the future of board composition and diversity, looking ahead, Lauren, what skills, backgrounds, and perspectives will be most critical for financial services boards, and how should the balance between independence, expertise, and diversity evolve to meet emerging challenges?
As you may know, there's been sort of a growing anti-ESG and anti-DEI movement in the United States.
Right.
So that D word, diversity, has become sort of taboo, and a lot of companies are removing it entirely from their websites, from their proxy statements, or replacing it with some other less controversial word or mix of words. We see like mix of backgrounds, inclusion, etc. But the truth is, the expectations for what constitutes good corporate governance practice and the expectations of institutional investors hasn't really changed. I mean, in order to have a functioning board, and a board that is well positioned and well qualified to deal with the needs of this increasingly complex and globalized economy, you need a mix of backgrounds, expertise, perspectives, gender diversity, racial diversity. And so that core principle hasn't changed, regardless of how you name it, or whether you call it diversity or something entirely different. You need to make sure you're constantly focused on having the right mix of backgrounds and skill sets in the boardroom. And that doesn't necessarily mean, go into your boardroom tomorrow and roll off all of your old, long tenured directors, because there's a lot of value actually to having institutional knowledge and experience in the boardroom. That in and of itself is a huge value add. But what it does mean is that you have to be very deliberative and very thoughtful in how you approach board refreshment and how you approach putting together that puzzle of different expertise, different experience, different backgrounds. One way to do that, and I think we've touched upon it already in this conversation, is to do skills matrices and to do demographic matrices for your board. Put together what you think are the key qualifications that you need for your board. And that can be highly dependent on your industry, on your company, on what the strategic needs of the company for the next 5 to 10 years may look like. But what are those 10 qualifications and areas of expertise that you think are necessary? And which ones are your directors already covering? And where do you maybe have some gaps that you're looking to cover in the future? And the same for demographics. I mean, what backgrounds are well covered on your board? And which ones do you think you may be lacking in certain ways? And then as you fill new spots or as new spots open up in the ordinary course, you should be interviewing with those things in mind. Some companies have what we call a Rooney rule, which is an explicit rule that they're going to prioritize underrepresented backgrounds when they interview for director positions. Some companies have gotten rid of those or not implemented those in the wake of the anti-ESG movement. But even if you don't have an explicit Rooney rule or something like it in your policies, you have to be thoughtful about what are we looking for, what are our gaps and our vulnerabilities on the board, and how do we do refreshment with an eye towards those.
Thank you, Loren. Terri?
I agree with everything Loren said. I think skills have to be at the forefront. Who's got the best skills to do this job? So an example is, engineers, the STEM world. There are not a lot of women in STEM yet. They've acknowledged that. So having STEM directors who are women, for example, is unlikely because they'll be getting the position because they're a woman, and that's positive discrimination, and we don't want that any more than we want negative discrimination. So it needs to be well thought out, and you need to consider the industry that you're in and the jurisdiction and those things, and make investments. So certainly in Britain, and I believe globally, a lot of money, the STEM world is putting a lot of money into bringing up more women and more people from diverse backgrounds. Dyson, the Hoover manufacturer, has started a university over here, and it incentivizes women to join STEM because we need the diversity. There's empirical evidence that a more balanced board positively impacts your bottom line. Harriet Harman said, if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman sisters, we wouldn't be in this pickle. It's not quite that simple. But I do think that we need balance. And I think it absolutely, and this is fed into the conversations we've had before, a skills matrix, which then tells us where our gaps are, and then fill the gaps based on that. Not ignoring diversity, but with a nod, that actually people from different backgrounds and different approaches have different things to bring. I did a board assessment for a group of 5. The board was 5 members. They were patting themselves on the back because they just brought 2 women onto the board. So they thought they were diverse. They had 3 men and 2 women. They were very pleased with themselves. I said, that's all great, but you're all accountants. So you're all the same personality type. You're all people who are drawn to that, people who are drawn to an industry or a qualification is because they are similar. So actually there's groupthink and all the risks that come with that. So I think we don't always think about the true nature of diversity. I think we get caught up in, boy, girl, tall, short, brown, white, and actually it's far more diverse than that, far more important.
And just because we have a little bit of time, I just wanted to add, I come at this from the shareholder activism perspective. A large part of my practice is doing shareholder activism defense. And so I could say with experience, if you're not actively refreshing your board, someone is going to come in and do it for you. People who are not focusing on board refreshment, who are not actively thinking about whether the board is well qualified and well positioned from a mix of backgrounds and perspectives, you're not only putting your company at risk from a strategic perspective, you're also making yourself incredibly vulnerable to investors coming in with an activism campaign and saying, look at this board. There's no way that they're qualified to take on the challenges that this company is facing. And then, they'll nominate people because, activists spend a ton of time, money, and resources, farming slates of directors that have all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of skill sets. And so they'll come on and they'll, nominate a slate of directors that have some of these backgrounds and some of these skill sets that your board may be lacking. And then, you're behind the 8 ball, and then it's oftentimes too late for a company to do the self-refreshment. They're stuck with directors that they didn't necessarily choose, or settling for directors that are mutually agreeable. But if you can do it ahead of time, and if you can be your own activist and engage in self-refreshment, we tell our clients, that's the best form of defense. That's the best way to do it, because then you're in the driver's seat and you could do it in a way that's well managed and thoughtful over time versus, being stuck in crunch time, having to refresh your board because you have an activist in the stock.
Excellent. Thank you. We actually have a couple of questions here that just rolled in from the audience. And one is actually a good segue from Terri's quote about Lehman Sisters. And the question is, I don't know if you guys, if you have any sort of metrics for this, but the question is, how true is it that companies with boards with women are proven to be less corrupt? Do you have any metrics regarding that? I'm going to throw that out there. I don't know if either of you want to tackle that or...
I don't think anybody wants to tackle that. Corruption, I don't know. I don't have metrics to hand for that. Women, and there's lots of sweeping statements in this, and stereotypes, but generally speaking, there's evidence that women are more risk averse, that they'll be more considered, and that they will consider the bigger picture more quickly than men will. So whether that feeds into corruption or not, I guess, let's put some more women on the boards. Let's see. Let's give it a couple of decades and let's see.
And I would also say, while I don't know about any studies that specifically look at corruption, there have been tons of studies that show that groups are more effective when you add women into them. And I think it's not necessarily women versus men. It's not like, women are better, therefore if you add women, you get a better outcome. It's more that a diverse set of perspectives is helpful because you're thinking of a problem from various angles versus, like Terri said, if you have a group that's just accountants, they can only think of a problem from one set of perspectives. If you have a group that comes at a problem from different backgrounds, from different walks of life, from different, educational backgrounds, professional backgrounds, you're more likely to get to an outcome that is the right answer. And so, again, don't know about corruption, but I would just say as a general matter, the more diverse the backgrounds on the board are, I think generally studies show that the more likely you are to have an effective group dynamic.
Thank you, Loren. We have a couple more questions. There's one here for you, Terri. Your work focuses on governance solutions. In a climate of evolving regulations, how can boards practically shift their mindset from viewing compliance as a cost center to treating it as an investment in strategic resilience? What's the first step a board should take?
I think recognizing that governance isn't business prevention is the first step. Governance, unfortunately, all regulations follow crises, as we saw from Lehman Brothers. It's something terrible, and it's not just law. It absolutely happens in medicine as well. As soon as something terrible happens, then legislation's put in place and then we improve. So it's almost like we have to go through the terrible stuff to get to the positive. The UK Corporate Governance Code is the gold standard across the world. That's brilliant. Way go us. Why is that? Because we've had the worst crises, because we've learned from experience, because we started all those years ago with Solomon and it ended up in court. I think the first thing is for a board of directors to understand that they don't know everything. There's this kind of, in the same way that we wake up one day as a manager and we suddenly are expected to, through osmosis, have learnt everything we need to know about managing people and performance expectations and holiday balance and all of those kind of things. there's this kind of, I'm a director now, I've arrived, I've finished my journey, I've got to the top, but actually there's so much more that needs to be learned. And a good board and a good chair are skills that need to be learned. And there's lots of soft skills and making sure that everybody in the room is heard. So I think the first thing they need to do is acknowledge that they don't know everything. And then a good company secretary or governance professional is their trusted advisor. Know what we don't know and get in the expertise that does.
Thank you, Terri. And we have another one here for Loren now. So there's an ongoing debate between stakeholder capitalism and shareholder primacy, as we have discussed. And how does this philosophical debate translate into concrete legal and governance responsibilities for a financial services board? Are they ultimate in conflict? I think we covered a lot of this. Do you want to just give us a very quick summary?
Yeah, my personal view is that if you view them as being in conflict, stakeholder optimization versus shareholder primacy, that's a very, very narrow way of looking at it. And I think you are going to end up in a lot of scenarios where it's just a very narrow way of looking at it, where one is going to win out and one is going to lose out. And I think ultimately they're very much intertwined, particularly if you think of shareholder primacy as the long-term value for shareholders. There's this other philosophical debate in corporate governance, aside from shareholder versus stakeholder, which is short-term versus long-term investor. And are you trying to maximize profits for short-term investors, or are you trying to maximize long-term value for those investors who have a long-term horizon? Generally we think of fiduciary duties of directors as maximizing the long-term value for stakeholders, for shareholders. I think you'd have a lot of difficulty maximizing long-term value for shareholders without considering stakeholder value, without considering the broader corporate ecosystem in which you function, because no company exists in a vacuum. Every company is part of a broader community and a broader ecosystem. And if you want the company to exist and function effectively in 5, 10, 20, 40 years, and make those profits for shareholders, you have to be thinking about stakeholder interests as well. So if you think of those as intertwined, I think that makes a lot of decisions easier to at least navigate and think about. And it makes it easier to make those decisions that look at the long-term interests of your shareholders and not just short-term financial performance of your stock.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Perfect, Loren. I think we're reaching the end, and I have one final question for the two of you. Basically, I want you to leave us with some parting remarks. Basically, what would be your top 3 lessons that anyone listening to this webinar should leave with from everything that has been discussed? Your top 3 tips, your top 3 lessons, whatever you want to call them. What would those be? Loren?
Yeah, I would say, to summarize sort of everything we've talked about and what my top 3 takeaways would be, the first is a director's approach should ideally be nose in, hands out, meaning your day-to-day responsibility is oversight of the management team, oversight of the company's risk profile, but you shouldn't be so involved that you're micromanaging the day-to-day operations of the business. And finding the balance between oversight and micromanagement is sometimes difficult in practice, but it's really essential that that's the function of a director, and that that's harmonious sort of with the function of the management team. The second I would say is make sure you're setting the right tone at the top, and the director should really lead by example to make sure that the company has the right cultural environment in order to manage risk and manage the strategic direction of the company. And let's see what else. And third, I would just say, what we talked about, boards, make sure that your board is well positioned for future management of oversight. And that means make sure you have the right mix of backgrounds, diversity of thought, diversity of background, skill sets, etc. And that means taking a really deliberate approach to refreshment of your board and taking a really deliberate approach to who you're interviewing to fill those new director seats.
Thank you, Loren. Terri?
Wow, that's a tough one to follow.
She took all the good ones, right? Is that what you can say?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think we need to remember that governance needs to be pragmatic. We're quite lucky in the UK that the regulations tend to be quite broad and it's up to us to interpret them, which is a benefit of common law jurisdictions. But we need to remember that we've still got to run a business. It can't just be brakes. We need the accelerators as well. Boards need to do, as Loren said, boards need to do more than set the strategy. They need to live and breathe the mission, vision and values. They need to bring it to life and have the culture. And governance is a business enabler. It allows businesses to do really well and have success. Governance isn't sexy because it's shiny. It's sexy because it keeps the lights on. It keeps everybody calm. It keeps the regulators happy and the strategy real. So if you want a heartbreak-free life, fall in love with governance.
Excellent. On that note, I'd like to thank both Loren and Terri for your excellent contributions. If anyone listening in has any follow-up questions, whether it's to myself as AGRC or to Terri, to Loren, you can either email us, email Ben and the team at ICLG, or find us on LinkedIn. And I think we'd be happy to answer any questions and follow up with anyone who might have any doubts or might need some more information on this fascinating subject. I'm going to hand things over back to Ben. You have another 4 minutes or so left to carry out your parting remarks. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mateo, and thank you all for a fantastic hour discussing the strategic corporate governance landscape. Some fantastic quotes there. Every policy is only as strong as its enforcement mechanism, from Loren. I love that. And culture eats strategy for breakfast, from Terri as well. Brilliant stuff. And well done, panel. 27 minutes before Coldplay Kiss Cam was brought up as well. That's very good work. And Mateo, throwing out that potential hand grenade of a question about studies on corruption or lack of on women in boards. So no hiding in this discussion. Well done, everyone. I'm sure we could have filled another hour quite easily, but it's good to save something for next time as well. So I hope that everyone who's tuned in today has found the session as interesting, dynamic and useful as I have. All that's left for me to say is please do keep your eyes open for more from the ICLG team around our corporate governance resources. Do take a look at the AGRC and how they can help you further as well. And of course, if you've any follow-up questions, please do reach out to us. And thanks again, Terri, Loren, and Mateo. All the best, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.